that may produce deleterious effects. So they might have to be chemically modified before they can be sent to the rest of the body. So when you have the absorption process take place, so after nutrients, after minerals, after chemicals have left the digestive tract, they then pass through the liver for sort of a processing so that it can be made safe for the rest of the body. So the liver is also, in addition to producing the bile, it's also responsible for removing any toxins, removing any pesticides that may be found on plant material, any carcinogens, and it converts them to a less toxic form so it doesn't harm the body itself. And this is actually what takes place when you drink alcohol. And anytime you ingest alcohol, what is the toxin? Ethanol. Ethanol is poison for the body. That is what is going on. Ethanol, when you drink alcohol, beer, wine, whatever it might be, it's poison for the body. So it enters into the liver, and the liver is converting this poison, this ethanol, into a less damaging form. This is also true of drugs that might be taken and so forth. The liver attempts to metabolize these. This is why people who drink for a very long time have damaged livers, because they've been putting their liver to so much work. They might end up needing something like a liver transplant because their livers no longer function as efficiently because they're being used so much. Another thing that the liver does is it also regulates steroid hormones. As the blood passes through liver, the liver can detect what sort of steroid hormones are found in the blood, and it can help regulate these much in a similar fashion that it's sort of removing and metabolizing these toxins. Finally, it also is responsible for producing most of the proteins that are found in plasma. Plasma is the extracellular matrix of the blood cells, which are special connective tissue. There are proteins that are found in the plasma that are used for a variety of bodily functions. The vast majority of these are produced by the liver itself. Because all the blood passes through the liver, this is a very efficient mechanism to add proteins to the liver, or to the blood itself, because you're guaranteed that it's going to be passing through. Now, one of the primary goals of ingesting food is to get energy. There are really two goals when you break down food. The first one we usually think about is energy. So the source of energy is sort of the first thing. When you get food, you break it down, you use the carbohydrates that you're ingesting as an energy source for the process of cellular respiration. But you also use it as a source of raw materials, building blocks for what your body needs to do. So as you're ingesting food, you're not just digesting and not just absorbing carbohydrates. You're absorbing amino acids. You're absorbing lipids. You're absorbing ions. You're absorbing electrolytes. You're absorbing minerals. You're absorbing vitamins. These are all things that the body can use and needs to use as raw material to build other biological molecules. Now, if you ingest too much energy, you end up storing the excess energy in the form of fatty acids. The body does not want to waste the energy. It doesn't excrete it. It doesn't lose it. It wants to store it. And so if you keep on ingesting too much food with too much energy, you store that excess energy. The same thing can happen if you're absorbing too many raw materials. You start having an excess of these. So the body basically saves whatever it can for a rainy day, under the assumption that there may be a time period where you're not going to be able to ingest as much as you need, and you can rely on these reserves that have been built up. Now, in terms of these raw materials that are being absorbed, these are sort of what we refer to as essential nutrients. The body is capable of making some raw materials themselves. Through various metabolic activities, the body can build some amino acids, the body can build some building blocks. But there are some things that they are incapable of building. They can't make all the nutrients themselves. We've talked about this a little bit with simple organisms like bacteria, where if you have a bacterial mutant and they can't produce a certain amino acid, you have to grow them on a culture. Now, most things like bacteria, when we talk about those, they can produce a vast array of amino acids themselves. But when we talk about more evolutionarily advanced organisms like animals, most animals cannot manufacture all the nutrients they need. They're required to ingest these. They're required to eat food that has these nutrients available. So some of these nutrients are necessary for health. They're necessary building blocks, and so they have to be obtained through the diet. These are what are referred to as essential nutrients. The body can't make them themselves, so the only way you can get them is through the food that you're eating. Now, what the essential nutrients actually are vary from animal to animal. Some animals can make amino acids that we can't. We can make some amino acids that other animals can't. So it does vary a little bit as to what the essential nutrients are for each animal. Vitamins are an example of an essential nutrient. A lot of mammals, including humans, apes, monkeys, and guinea pigs, have lost the ability to make their own ascorbic acid. This is vitamin C. This is why everyone always says, eat your oranges. Oranges, citrus fruits are high in vitamin C. Orange juice is high in vitamin C. We need this. This is an essential nutrient for some of the building blocks and the raw materials, but we can't make it ourselves. The only way we can get it is through the food that we ingest. Amino acids, how many amino acids are there? 20 different amino acids. So the amino acids, humans require 9 different amino acids in order to, that they can't produce themselves. The other ones we can make them ourselves, but certain amino acids we need the body, we need to ingest as food. Otherwise there's no way we're going to get them. Certain unsaturated fatty acids, we can synthesize some. Other vertebrates can't synthesize some. So lots of vertebrates can synthesize cholesterol, but some insects are unable to do that. They're an animal, they're unable to synthesize this, they need to get some of these fatty acids in the form of essential nutrients that they require. So what animals actually require as essential nutrients vary from animal to animal, but the only way they're going to get these are through food that they ingest. And certainly minerals, we cannot synthesize minerals at all. Any minerals that are required for raw materials need to be ingested 100%. So that brings us to the end of the digestive system. You now have an overview of what the digestive system is, how it works, what's going on in the individual components, and variations that we see within different animals. So we're going to move down and talk about the next system, the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is all about gas exchange, extracting oxygen from the environment. Not necessarily the atmosphere, because we have animals living in aquatic environments. They're not getting access to atmospheric oxygen, but they still need to engage in this gas exchange. They still need to get the oxygen they need for cellular respiration. So the idea of gas exchange is sort of broken down into 3 fundamental concepts. The first of these is that there's a challenge in obtaining oxygen. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do to extract the oxygen that you need. And in addition to doing that, as you're using the oxygen, you're producing carbon dioxide. That is a waste product. You need to have some way of getting rid of that as well. So gas exchange is sort of overcoming this challenge of getting the oxygen you need and then releasing the carbon dioxide that's being produced. Now, the idea of gas exchange is that in vertebrates, you have gas exchange that occurs in an aqueous layer. The epithelial lining that line the respiratory organs in vertebrates have to be covered in water. They have a small, thin aqueous layer that enables the gas exchange. Now, for vertebrates that are living in an aquatic system, that's very easy, because what's around you all the time? Water. You don't need to worry about trying to produce the water, keeping the respiratory organs wet. But in terrestrial organisms, when you have the respiratory organs, you need to keep them wet in order to facilitate gas exchange. And finally, the third idea is that this is a process that is driven by diffusion. Diffusion is a passive process. It doesn't require energy. The body is not using energy to engage in this exchange process. The only thing that is causing this exchange is a difference in concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So when you have the respiratory organ that has the aqueous layer, and you're trying to absorb the oxygen and release the carbon dioxide, the only way that that is going to work is if there's a higher concentration of oxygen on one side, outside the organism, so that oxygen will diffuse in, and if there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide inside the organism, so that carbon dioxide will diffuse out. There's no mechanical pumps or anything like that that are physically moving these molecules in or out of the systems, out of the bodies themselves. We do have pumps that move the surrounding atmosphere or the water, but they're not actually moving the molecules into the body or out of the body. So it's an entirely passive process driven by the process of diffusion. Now, gas exchange is governed by a mathematical law. It's called Fick's law of diffusion. Since we're talking about a passive process of diffusion, the rate at which the diffusion takes place can be measured. It can be calculated based on a variety of factors. So if we sort of refer to the rate of diffusion as R, that's going to be based on what's referred to as the diffusion constant. That's going to vary based on the gas that we're talking about. It's going to vary based on the area over which diffusion takes place. It's going to vary based on delta T, which is the pressure difference between the two sides. Sort of this, again, going back to this idea of the partial pressures again. Except instead of talking about water partial pressure, we're now talking about gas partial pressure. And then it's going to also vary based on this value lowercase d, which is the distance over which the diffusion has to take place. So this is Fick's law of diffusion right here. So the rate of diffusion is going to be capital D, the diffusion constant, times the area over which the diffusion takes place, times the differential of pressure between the two sides, divided by the distance over which the diffusion takes place. So that is how quickly these molecules, whether it's oxygen or gas, are going to move across the epithelial layers of the membrane. So if that's the formula for organisms, the goal is to increase this rate of diffusion. Organisms want to have diffusion work quickly. This means they're going to be able to get rid of the carbon dioxide quickly. This is a waste product. It's not going to build up in the body. It means they're going to be able to absorb the oxygen quickly. That's something they need. The more oxygen you absorb, the more cellular respiration you can undergo, the more energy you can utilize. So what are some ways that you can make sure that this R is going to increase? The D is going to always remain the same. That's going to be based on the molecule that is diffusing. So you can't change that. What are ways that you can have R be as large a number as possible?
Increasing the area?
Increasing the A value, the area of diffusion. So this is simply the idea, if you increase surface area, diffusion is going to increase. What is something else? Decrease D. Decrease the distance that the molecules have to diffuse across. If you have to diffuse across a really large area, diffusion is going to be very slow. If you have to diffuse across a very thin area, then diffusion is going to be much faster. And what's the last one? Pressure. What do you want to do with that? Increase it. If you increase anything on the top, you're going to speed up the rate of diffusion. If you decrease anything on the bottom, you're going to speed up the rate of diffusion. So when we talk about evolutionary changes that we see in animals, these are all to optimize this rate of diffusion, all to make this rate of diffusion as fast as possible. You're going to see increases in the surface area. We're going to see decreases in the distances or the thickness of the epithelial membrane. And we're going to see increases in the concentration that will result in an increase in the partial pressures. So those are all going to be adaptations that we see in different vertebrate respiratory systems that are and invertebrates as well in order to increase this rate of diffusion. Now, when we talk about this process of gas exchange, we have to look at what's going on in different kinds of organisms. When we have a unicellular organism, they need oxygen as well. They have mitochondria. They need that for cellular respiration. They're producing carbon dioxide with the mitochondria. They need to be able to get rid of that. But because it's a single-celled organism, all that needs to happen is you're going to have gases diffuse in and out directly. It's an extremely small organism. The only difference is going to be what's on the other side or on the other sides of the plasma membrane. It's a very small area, so diffusion can occur very easily across that. So unicellular organisms don't need to worry about having systems, having a mechanism, having an organ system or anything like that for gas exchange because it's very easy for them to do it with across their plasma membrane. Once you start to become multicellular, then you need to find ways to have evolutionary adaptations to increase the efficiency of this gas exchange. So most multicellular animals are going to have some sort of system, some sort of adaptation to exchange gas exchange. And it's not just limited to animals. What's one of the systems that plants have to facilitate gas exchange? Stomata. They open and close. That's going to alter the concentration of the oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules. That's going to increase the rate of diffusion. So plants have this as well, but we're focusing on animals. So when we talk about multicellular animals, they're all going to have a variety of adaptations. Amphibians, what they engage in respiration across their skin. This is one reason why it's important that amphibians are wet most of the time, because that's going to increase the respiration process. But with amphibians, we first see the evolution of the lung. So with terrestrial organisms, they're going to usually have some sort of lung-like structure. Echinoderms have what we refer to as protruding papillae. These are basically extensions of the body system that extend through pores in the exoskeleton of the echinoderms, and they're going to increase the surface area for diffusion. Increasing surface area increases the rate. Insects have an extensive tracheal system. This is increasing the surface area as the trachea gets smaller and smaller. So again, increasing the surface area increases the rate of diffusion. Fish use gills. We'll talk in specific about what gills are doing. Mammals have a large network of alveoli. So these are all specific adaptations in multicellular animals to increase the rate of gas exchange. So if we look at them, single-celled organisms, they can just do it across the plasma membrane. Amphibians, they have blood vessels that move very close to the epidermis. They can, because the epidermis is wet, they can easily exchange gas across through respirate, or they can exchange gas through cutaneous respiration. Echinoderms have the papillae. These are extensions of the epidermis to increase surface area. The insects have the spiracles and the tracheoles. These are going to get smaller and smaller in size, increasing surface area. Fish have gills to increase surface area. Mammals have the alveoli to increase surface area. So those are all specific adaptations to increase the efficiency of gas exchange. Make it easier for the animals to get the oxygen they need, release the carbon dioxide that's being produced. So let's talk a little bit about gills. Gills are basically just specialized extensions of tissue that oftentimes will project into the water. And the only purpose that gills have is to increase surface area. Because what's happening with respiration in animals that are completely aquatic is they're absorbing the oxygen from the water itself, and they're releasing their carbon dioxide back into the water. So the way you can improve the efficiency here is to have a larger surface area for absorption to take place. Now, their gills are sort of classified into two structures. One of these are referred to as external gills. External gills, as you can see from the salamander here, are completely external. They're not enclosed within the body. They're not covered with gill structures or anything like that. They're just in the water, increasing the surface area, allowing diffusion to take place. So these are oftentimes found in immature fish. Amphibians oftentimes have external gills. Some aquatic insects have external gills as well. It's an efficient mechanism because you're exposing the blood vessels directly through the tissue to the water to allow for this gas exchange to take place. But there are some problems with external gills. One of these is that they have to be consistently moved. With external gills, you're exposing them to the water. The water always has to move. So if you're not in a flowing water source, you either have to move the gills themselves or the organism itself needs to move around. This is going to make sure that the water that's being in contact with the gills is always going to have a high oxygen concentration. If the water doesn't move and the gills are extracting all the oxygen and putting carbon dioxide into the water, what's eventually going to happen? Well, eventually, the concentration of oxygen in the water around the gills is going to be so low that the gills are the oxygen is going to start diffusing the other direction. The concentration in the bloodstream is going to be higher, so you have diffusion occurring of oxygen out of the bloodstream into the water. And the reverse will then happen with carbon dioxide. Because the concentration of carbon dioxide in the water is building up, eventually it will become so high, it will diffuse back into the organism. So this is why you need to keep these gills always moving or keep the water always moving. Another disadvantage is that they're be exposed. They're out there. They can be easily damaged. They can be picked off by predators. They can be damaged by the environment. And if you have a damaged gill, that is no longer going to be efficient for extracting oxygen. So those are the external gills and a couple disadvantages. We also have internal gills. These are primarily found in bony fish. Internal gills are going to be located inside the body. They're located between the oral cavity and the opercular cavity. And basically what happens in fish is you have these two cavities that are capable of expanding and contracting. And what is that going to do? It's going to continually move the water across the gills. So the two cavities, the oral cavity and the opercular cavity, can alternately expand and contract, acting as a pump to move the water across the gills, making sure there's always going to be oxygenated water running across the gills. So what happens with fish is you have fish, the water moves into the mouth. Mouth then contracts, pushing the water across the gills as the opercular cavity expands. So you have a dual pump mechanism. As it moves across the gills, the oxygen is extracted. Eventually, the water moves out of the fish through the open operculum, or what's also sometimes referred to as the gill cover. Then when that's finished, the fish ingests more water. It's not for drinking. It's to move that water across the gills. Now, there are a few fish that don't have opercula that can move. Those gill plates, those gill covers cannot expand, cannot pump back and forth. What this means is with those fish, they need to swim all the time. Just as we talked about with external gills, you need to have the flow of water. With internal gills, you still need to have the flow of water. If you can't pump the water yourself, the fish itself needs to move in order to maintain a continual water flow. Otherwise, the same thing is going to happen where you have a buildup of carbon dioxide and a decrease of oxygen. So this is what the gills look like in fish. You have water moving into the jaw, through the jaw, into the oral cavity. These are the gill structures. Here the operculum is closed. Eventually it will expand and open up. The water then moves across the gills where the diffusion takes place and then out past the operculum. Once that's finished, then water will move back into the oral cavity. So you sort of have this continual flow of water that is taking place. Now within the gills, fish usually have about anywhere from 3 to 7 gill arches that are sort of found on the sides of the fish's head. Each of these is composed of 2 rows of gill filaments. The gill filaments are the actual structures where diffusion is taking place. On each of these filaments, you have what are referred to as lamellae, and these are the thin membranous plates that project into the water flow. They need to project into the water flow because that's where the diffusion occurs. They're taking oxygen out, they're putting carbon dioxide back in. So the diffusion takes place on these individual gill lamellae that are found on the gill filaments. When water flows past one of these lamellae, it's going to only flow in one direction. What is that going to enable us to engage in? What's that going to make easier? What are they trying to do? Breathe. How do they get their oxygen? Begins with a D. Diffusion. What we've just been talking about. So with the water flowing in one direction, it's going to enable for more efficient diffusion. So it's going to increase the ability of the fish to extract as much oxygen as possible from the water itself. So if you look sort of at a close-up, this is what the gill looks like. This is the gill arch. On each of those arches, we have gill filaments. This is one gill filament right here. On each of the gill filaments, we have these lamellae that are sticking up. These are flattened membranes that are filled with blood vessels. Water flows across the gill filament. And it flows in the opposite direction as the blood flow. We'll talk about that momentarily. but we have a unidirectional flow of water. Water is always going to be moving in that direction across the gill folds. So within each of these lamellae, the blood is also flowing in one direction, but it's flowing in an opposite direction. This is what is referred to as countercurrent flow. Countercurrent flow is an adaptation we see in a lot of different kinds of organisms, not just with respiration, but it's an idea that's there to maximize the exchange. In this case, we're talking about maximizing the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, allowing as much oxygen to enter the blood as possible, allowing as much carbon dioxide to leave the blood as possible. Basically, what the countercurrent flow does is it increases the delta P value. And if you increase delta P, you increase the rate at which diffusion takes place. If you look at these respiratory organs, look at their ability to extract oxygen from their environment. Of all respiratory organs that are out there, fish gills are simply the most efficient. They're the best at extracting oxygen. Better than lungs, better than trachea, better than alveoli, better than anything that any other animal uses. So when we have this countercurrent exchange, what we have is on one side we have the blood flowing, and blood is going to flow, starts off on one side. This is where blood has a very low concentration of oxygen, a very high concentration of carbon dioxide. It's going to flow in one direction. The oxygen in the water, or the water is going to flow the other direction. It starts off having a high concentration of oxygen, a low concentration of carbon dioxide. And so what that means is these percentages show the concentration of oxygen as the water flows through. These percentages show the concentration of oxygen in the blood as the blood flows through. Which side of those is always higher? The water. The higher concentration means that the delta P is going to be higher, so you're always going to have water or oxygen flowing from the water into the blood. It's the exact opposite for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to be very high here, very low here on the blood. Carbon dioxide is going to be very low here, very high here on the water. And so you're always going to have a higher concentration in the blood than in the water. And so carbon dioxide is always going to flow out. If you didn't have countercurrent flow, if oxygen and water both entered at the same place, the blood would always start off with a very low oxygen concentration. Oxygen's been used, the blood needs more oxygen. The water would always start off with a very high oxygen concentration. You start off where you have a situation where you have it higher on one side, lower on the other. But as it flows across, eventually you're going to reach an equilibrium. And what happens once you reach equilibrium? There's no more diffusion. There's no more net movement of oxygen in one direction. So you do move oxygen in one direction, but once you reach that equilibrium, you have no more diffusion taking place, so you only end up with a 50% saturation. That is not as efficient as ending up with an 85% saturation. So the countercurrent flow enables for more extraction of oxygen. It's a more efficient mechanism for pulling the oxygen out of the water. Pull out your clickers for a second. Why do you think the fish gills need to be the most efficient of the respiratory organs? Is it because fish need more oxygen than other animals due to their increased activity due to swimming? The oxygen is more difficult to get underwater. Fish waste more oxygen because they use a different form of cellular respiration. Or fish use oxygen more rapidly because they are endotherms and need to regulate internal body temperature. Talk it over, submit your answers.
Nice answer. Yeah. Sure. But if you speak. Kill me, honestly, please move over there. Because really, I don't stop. and then just start. I just
So D. B. Selfish.
Wait, did you say B or D? B as in border.
no, it wasn't an ounce word. It was like it wasn't an ounce. I don't even know where it went anymore. It was my USB card. But I had to get my mouth so I can stop chattering. Yeah, that's I had to read my yeah, that was probably it was.
20 seconds left.
Actually, because oxygen is super. There's only a certain amount of oxygen dissolved in the water, isn't there?
D?
Because if they don't have enough dissolved oxygen, they die. Yeah.
Let's see what everyone said.
Yeah. No results.
Where are the results?
Do you have to click the bars on the bottom of the
No,
plate?
they should do. Those does it automatically. All right, there we go. All right, so most people said B. A few people said a little bit of everything else. B is the correct answer. So let's say you didn't know that. Is it possible to use looking at these other answers to try and figure it out?
Yes.
Well, let's look at answer D first. Fish use oxygen more rapidly because there are endotherms that need to regulate internal temperature. There are two problems with this answer. What are the two problems?
Fish are ectotherms?
Well, first of all, fish are ectotherms. They aren't endotherms. But if they weren't, if you didn't know that, what's another problem with this answer? We're endotherms. If being endothermic requires more oxygen, then all other endotherms would need more oxygen as well. So that would mean that fish don't need to have the most efficient respiratory system. Any endotherm is going to need to have an efficient respiratory system. So you can rule D out as a possible answer. What about C? Fish waste more oxygen because they use a different form of cellular respiration. What's wrong with this answer?
They don't use different forms of respiration?
Every living organism uses the same form of cellular respiration. Every living cell has mitochondria. Every living cell that has mitochondria uses the same form of cellular respiration. So you should be able to immediately say there is no different form of cellular respiration, so C is not correct. Fish need more oxygen than other animals due to increased activity, their swimming activity. What's wrong with this answer?
Swimming doesn't take that much.
Why not?
Because the current.
Because
The current underwater.
he's in current.
Current underwater.
Because what?
Like there's an underwater current.
Well, not just currents, because what if you're swimming against the current? But what does water do?
It lightens you.
It lightens it. There's a buoyancy that's associated with water. Now, the fish do swim a lot, but certainly we have animals in terrestrial environments that are just as active as fish. Birds flying around, for example, and they don't have the benefit of being buoyant. They have to completely be able to lift their entire body weight with their wing muscles. So that actually requires more energy than we see in fish, that fish need for swimming. So we can rule out A. So even if you didn't know that oxygen is more difficult to extract underwater because of the fact it's dissolved in the water itself, you should be able to rule out other answers in order to identify the correct one. So from underwater respiration, sort of this process of using gills, which is used by underwater amphibians, used by fish, used by some aquatic insects, we now move to terrestrial respiration. As we already mentioned, a lot of amphibians engage in cutaneous respiration, absorbing oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide directly through their skin. But what we see in the evolution of terrestrial animals, especially terrestrial vertebrates, is the evolution of lungs. Lungs specifically evolved in amphibians and all descendants as a mechanism for gas exchange, as an ability to get gas from the atmosphere. So lungs consist of air ducts that are called trachea that branch into smaller and smaller and smaller tracheoles. The tracheoles themselves come in direct contact with individual cells. So we have a situation now where we're increasing surface area by getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so that eventually you can have the tracheole, the oxygen that's in the atmosphere, come in direct contact with individual cells to increase the rate of respiration. Now, spiracles, which are found in insects, sort of serve the same purpose. The spiracles and the trachea that are found there are going to be moving into smaller and smaller vesicles until they come into direct contact as well. We'll continue talking about the evolution of lungs when we get to Monday.